Hello everyone, Bag here, and welcome to my first ever guide. Starting us off, we are looking at Moze, who is coming up on the first half banner for 2.5 alongside Facial. Moze is a 4-star landing hunt unit that acts as a follow-up attacking sub-DPS, filling a similar role to the recently released Hunt March. But how does he fare when compared to her? How do you build him? And how necessary are his Eidolons? Well, that's everything that we'll be going over, but first, let's start with his kit. His basic attack is not anything special, just being a single target attack, but his skill is the real meat of his kit. Using his skill marks an enemy as the prey, which counts as a debuff. Marking an enemy causes Moze to leave the field. Until the mark is removed, he is gone from the action bar and cannot be targeted by allies or enemies. He can still be affected by team-wide buffs, he just can't be specifically targeted by something single target. So how do you remove this mark? Well, when Moze marks an enemy, he gains 9 stacks of charge. When allies attack the marked enemy, not only will he contribute some of his attack as additional lightning damage, similar to how Ting Yun works, but a charge is also consumed, and for every 3 charge stacks consumed, Moze immediately launches a follow-up attack against a marked enemy. So 3 stacks for 9 charges means that he gets 3 follow-ups per marked duration. After all charges are consumed, he comes back to the field. If the marked enemy is defeated before all the charges are consumed, Moze comes back early, losing all the charge stacks he has in the process. His ult is just a simple big hit that can even be used when he's not on the field. Unlike his talent's follow-ups, which don't consume charge, his ultimate does, meaning he can help himself proc follow-ups faster by using his ult. Speaking of which, after he does his ultimate hit, he procs his follow-up attack immediately afterwards, separate from any of his charge stacks that he has at the time. Finally, his technique causes him to go into a stealth mode, becoming hidden from enemies. When he attacks an enemy while in stealth, he will gain a buff in combat that makes him deal 30% more damage for 2 turns. Moving on to his traces, his first one recovers a skill point after using a follow-up, once per turn. So this means it'll usually be the first follow-up after he skills, but this can also be done earlier with his ult. But since you are basically using his skill every time it's his turn, this essentially just means that he is a truly SP neutral unit, which is kind of rare to see. His second trace makes it so that when he comes back onto the field, he gets action advanced forward by 20%. Also, when a new wave starts, his action is advanced 30%. Moze's biggest weakness is his downtime after his mark runs out, so this trace helps to alleviate this. The second part also helps him set up his skill before his allies can attack. Finally, his third trace is his most important one. First, it makes his ult be considered as a follow-up attack, which matters for builds, and also for very niche cases like being able to push forward Numby or giving a Venturine a passive stack. Then, the trace also increases the follow-up attack damage taken by the marked enemy by 25%. What's really important here is that this trace counts as a second debuff, separate from just marking the enemy as the prey. This means that even at E0, he can consistently apply 2 debuffs to the enemy, which is important to consider for team building. Next, let's go over his Eidolons to see how valuable they are. His first Eidolon gives him 20 energy for entering battle, and also, every time his talent's extra damage occurs, he regenerates 2 energy. To clarify, this talent damage is not his follow-up, but rather the lightning damage he contributes anytime an ally attacks a marked target. While this extra energy does not allow him to ult on turn 1, it does overall help his energy rotation, which is very important. How fast he launches his attacks is a very large part of his utility when paired with Facial, so expediting his ult by a turn makes him a lot stronger, especially since leaving the field means that he can't be hit for extra energy a lot of the time. His second Eidolon is his most important one, increasing the crit damage that allies do against a marked target by 40%. This helps his supporting role, making him competitive with March in terms of buffing. It should be noted that this is just an additional add-on for his first debuff. This Eidolon does not count as a third separate debuff. His second Eidolon is generally recommended as his stopping point, but his other Eidolons are not half bad either. His third Eidolon increases ult and talent damage, which is the majority of his damage, so that's nice. His fourth Eidolon gives him a self 30% damage buff for 2 turns after he uses his ult. This is a sizable personal damage increase. It's certainly a valuable addition, but it doesn't make him fill his niche any better. Personal damage is great, but if he fills a role in a team well at E2, E4 won't change that much, so do not feel pressured to go for it. His fifth Eidolon ups his basic and skill, which is terrible, so let's just move on. Finally, his sixth Eidolon increases the damage multiplier of his follow-up by 25%. Just like with his E4, this is a good damage amp, but it isn't necessary for making him usable in the roles he's good in. It's great if you have it, but stopping at E2 is good enough for him. Finally, we move on to the build section. This is pretty straightforward, but there are some caveats to go over. For his relics, you want the Pioneer set, as it fits him very nicely. But since he only applies 2 debuffs, you need a third debuff somewhere on your team to complete the set effect. Aventurine's ult might not be enough if you change targets frequently, so keep that in mind for facial teams if you don't have Aventurine's signature. Even at just 2 debuffs, this set is still better than his next option, Duke. Duke can work even though he doesn't have that many hits in his follow-up, so if you have the set farmed, you can make it work for him. If you don't have a 4-piece, mixing these 2 sets or mixing in a 2-piece attack set can also work. For planers, it's pretty clear cut. His constant follow-ups make Durin very easy to stack up, but Izumo is not that far behind assuming you use him with another hunt, which I mean you probably will be doing most of the time. Other than that, Salsodo is the next universal option, and if you have none of them, either just go on substats or just use anything that gives a crit or attack base effect. For stats, opt for crit on the body, probably crit rate since he has crit damage traces. For boots, attack is better most of the time as his action advance forward already covers his speed problems a good amount. For the sphere, damage percent is always a bit better than attack percent, but just use whatever has better substats. And for the rope, I would generally recommend attack, but ER is an option. Essentially, if you only care about Moze for his frequent attacks, and if you are okay with dumping his damage for incremental gains, you can go ER rope for something like a Feixiao team. But I would generally recommend against this unless if your Feixiao is just absolutely wailed out and no one on your team can even begin to compare with her. Most of the time, just keep it simple and stick with an attack rope. Now for Lycones, and we have some pretty exciting options. He is a rare hunt unit, where cruising is actually dethroned as his best non-limited option. Since both Swordplay and Final Victor revolve around hitting an enemy multiple times to stack up damage, they both work very well for him. Just make sure with Swordplay not to use your ult on a different target, as this will reset his stacking. If you don't have these leveled, then cruising can still work, but one of its big effects being based on defeating an enemy may be hard for him to have consistently up. When looking at his limited options, the obvious one is Topaz's for the extra team damage buff, or Ratio for the insane self-damage buff. The problem with both of these is that if you have these limited Lycones on their respective characters, there's little reason to take them off and to put them on the Moze. Topaz and Moze cover the same slot in a team, so the only reason you'd really give him her Lycone is if you just prefer him, or if you just need the additional debuff, since he comes with 2 at E0 while Topaz just comes with 1. I do see a world where you are not using Ratio but you are using Moze, so giving him his Lycone in this situation is a fantastic option. Overall, Swordplay is more than enough for him, but if your account allows for it, then these are great options as well. Finally, we get to teams, and this is where we have to go over his 2 defined niches. He has a good amount of attacks, and he has 2 debuffs. These debuffs are not applied frequently enough for Acheron, however, as they are just applied once when he skills, so that useful niche that debuffers usually have is kind of not there for him. His main want from his team is a high amount of attacks to proc his follow-ups, and his specific buff for follow-ups in his trace means that the natural fit for him are follow-up units who attack very frequently. First off, Feixiao. He is very clearly made for Feixiao, as her frequent follow-ups pair extremely well with him, and her ult being considered as follow-up damage means that she can make full use of all of his debuffs. I'd say that Topaz is generally better if you have her, but at E6, Moze is pretty competitive. Or you can even just use them together. Triple follow-up is worse than just using Robin, but it gets points for seriously just being very fun to use. Overall, yes, he is great with Feixiao. I'd say Moze is probably her best sub DPS if you don't have a built Topaz. Next, there's Ratio. Moze's 2 debuffs makes him a very natural choice here, as Ratio's constant follow-ups means that he can synergize very well with Moze's charges. In this slot, Moze is just a replacement for Topaz, but here he has a bit more of a niche since he has more debuffs than her at E0. If your Topaz is heavily invested, then she's clearly just stronger here, but this might be a case where giving Moze her Lycone has some use case, since that's a total of 3 debuffs compared to 2 with Topaz at E0 S1. I'd also say that he's decently better than Pela depending on how single target the fight is, as if you switch targets enough, then her AoE ult debuffs ends up being more useful. You can also run him on an all men team, which is pretty fun, or you can also just pair them with Robin, since the sustainer can help complete the amount of debuffs that Ratio needs. Lastly, he does have a bit of a niche with the countering units, since him leaving the field means that they are more likely to be hit. If you are against an enemy that attacks a lot, then their counterattacks might be fast enough to make Moze work well. This means that their synergy is pretty dependent on the fight, but it can work well in the right scenario. Finally, let's end this off by comparing him with the Hunt March, who fills a very similar role, especially in facial teams. In general, at Moze E6, he is pretty interchangeable with her. He provides slightly better damage amping, and he can attack about as fast as her depending on how fast his teammates are, but he loses out on not being able to generate as much SP, compared to March, who only ever needs to use 1 SP before being purely SP positive. I'd say overall that Moze is better at E2 and onwards, but even at E0, he can still be comparable depending on how fast your team can consume his charges. So that's Moze, a pretty strong unit with pretty strong niches, and with enough investment he can be comparable to his 5-star competition in some very notable roles. Follow for more and watch my other vids. Bye!